Hello. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Um, my guest today is filmmaker, cinema programmer, video essayist, and writer Chris O'Neill. His video essays include I Start Counting and Jeremy. And his films include Dream Awake and I Wake Up Screaming. Thanks for talking to me, Chris.
Oh, thank you for asking me. I always enjoy having a chat with you, even if it's recorded or not.
So I guess I'll start with the Triskel Art Centre. Obviously, they've been closed due to COVID for the last while, and I know that they're doing online events and that you've a long a long history with programming. And I wanted to, even in relation to Robert Aldridge, I remember you saying an early example of screening. I think it was Baby Jane. Is that right? He used to do screenings on a Sunday. Was it Baby Jane?
Yeah, so I've been programming Triskel Art Centre in Cork City now for 10 years, almost 10 years. 10 years. I started there in July of 2011, and initially I was just a kind of a special events programmer slash general organizer of the cinema, while the Irish Film Institute did the main programming. But I had a strong say in that programming, and because before that I used to program the Kino Cinema in Cork, eventually I ended up just taking over the whole program and doing the entire Triskel's cinema screenings, bookings, etc. The Baby Jane event you're talking about was in the final year of my previous cinema, Kino. For about a year, every Sunday we were doing, it was like the first Sunday of every month, I think, we were doing like midday screenings of classic movies. And we, of course, back then it was only 35. The venue never upgraded to digital, which was kind of one of the reasons why the venue didn't survive beyond that time. I remember the first one we ever did was the 1931 Dracula, the Bela Lugosi Dracula. And the other films we showed were Baby Jane, as you mentioned, Key Largo, Suspicion, the Hitchcock, Badland, Repulsion. Sure, there are a few more I'm forgetting, but yeah, this was this nice thing. We were showing these movies, but what was, you know, talk about for the love of doing it rather than for any financial gain. By the time we shipped a 35 mil print over from the UK and back, and then the percentage was taken off the box office, we always just about broke even, if we were lucky. But we always used to love programming it and doing it. We'd have introductions. Sometimes I did them. Maximilian McCain did one or two. Colin McAuliffe did a few. Um, an actor friend of mine used to work in Kino. Ed Cashman did one as well. And the thing about Kino was, because it was like a one screen cinema and it operated as a 7 day a week cinema, it was very difficult to vary from the daily program. So if you had a film starting on a Friday or two films starting on a Friday, we were very hesitant to take something out and put something else in during that 7 day schedule. I mean, obviously we did sometimes. So those Sunday screenings, it was actually at 11:30 we used to start rather than midday. And we used to get anything. The lowest we ever had was 54 people, and the most we had was like 112. And that was the nice feeling that even at a not necessarily fantastic time slot on a Sunday, we used to get that kind of audience. And it was great showing those old prints as well. I mean, a lot of them were the reissue prints from Park Circus or the British Film Institute. But they just looked amazing. And a lot of the films being black and white. For me, the first movie I ever saw was in the Kino, so 17 or 18. I'd seen Psycho before this, but the first 1940s classic kind of film that was in the kind of zeitgeist of films you should sort of see, like something like Hitchcock being more sort of, shall we say, acceptable to a film viewer, was Mildred Pierce. And up until that time, like black and white movies to me were just something that was on BBC Two on a Tuesday afternoon or something. And I used to find them I just couldn't really get into them. I just, generally speaking, of course, they just didn't seem to be for me. And that time I saw Mildred Pierce at Kino before I worked there, just as a punter. I found it like a really just mind-blowing experience, because suddenly in this space, so surrounded in the darkness of the theater, here I am watching this movie that was made in 1945, and this would have been 1999. I was completely in the space of it, in its zone, and it felt like it was just made yesterday, kind of thing. So I would try when I could, when possible, to show retrospective screenings there. And then since then at Triskel, where we're 100% digital, I still try to do the same kind of thing. And for example, every Christmas, for the last like 8 or 9 years, we've shown It's a Wonderful Life. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've done Casablanca every February 14th. And now these are obviously very, there's an annual seasonal element to them, and they're quite the most popular of films that people reference and things. But it's still showing them on a big screen, in the context of with an audience in a theatrical space. I think it really makes a big difference, and it's an important thing to do. And as a film watcher, it's an important way to experience films.
Yeah.
So yeah. So the Baby Jane screening came from that era of my programming, which was when we were doing 35mm prints. And I like Aldrich a lot, but the women pictures, shall we say, that he did, Baby Jane, Killing His Sister George, The Legend of Lila Clare in particular, are ones that I'm a great admirer of.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the Killing of Sister George, and obviously the Coral Bryan, obviously between the two films, is in Lila Clare as well. She's quite an interesting presence. But you mentioned as well, Capra, obviously It's a Wonderful Life is a big kind of Christmas film for Irish audiences. Have you watched much other Frank Capra films?
Not really, no. And it's not out of not wanting to. I have found there are certain films and filmmakers that for a long time I would hold off seeing their work, hoping somehow that I would experience them in a theatrical setting. Because, and particularly with kind of older black and white movies of like the 40s, I've always felt that when I've seen them the first time in a theatrical setting, I really not just enjoy them, but I find them very absorbing. Like I was very lucky the first time I ever saw Citizen Kane or The Magnificent Ambersons, for example, two Wells films, or Night of the Hunter. I saw them theatrically, and in fact, I think the first time I ever saw Casablanca was theatrically, which was a bizarre experience. It was in Hamburg, in Germany, in a print that was in English but with German subtitles. And there was me and my now wife, then girlfriend, enjoying just the witty dialogue, between Hope Bogart, etc. And we were laughing at those, and the audience were quiet. But then, anytime there was like a sly sort of dig at the Nazis or something, the German audience were laughing, which was a really bizarre experience. But yeah, in terms of Capra, I haven't, no. But I have to say, we've been showing It's a Wonderful Life like 9 years now, and every time I've seen it before, I've seen the whole thing before, but anytime I catch moments of it when we're showing it over these years, um, depending on maybe where I am sometimes in my own life and things, uh, some of it can really hit hard, and some of it's just so potentially dark as well. It is dark. I mean, there's a nice resolution at the end, but um, yeah. So I really like that film, and I do intend to see more. It's just it's some shape or form holding out to see them in a theatrical setting, I guess.
Yeah, no, Meet John Doe I thought was quite special, and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. I always felt there was a, the Tony Soprano would always say that Gary Cooper was like the strong American who never complained, but he just seems to be a much more complex than that.
Yeah, and Gary Cooper, the few films I have seen with him in, such as High Noon, one of those actors who maybe was taken a little bit for granted and isn't as remembered in the same way as a lot of your other actors of the period. Um, but he was a very, perhaps he blended a little bit too much into the background sometimes in terms of wasn't too showy or had a strong personality like a lot of stars tend to. Is in the personalities can sometimes dominate the character, if you like, or the certain moments. Whereas Cooper could just be very good, but wouldn't exactly say understated, but not as forceful, if you like, in terms of imposing his own characteristics on characters. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you've been making the video essays over the last year, is that right, or more?
Yeah. So my friend Jonathan, who set up Fun City Editions, the US Blu-ray label, he invited me in September 2019 to contribute some video essays to his upcoming film releases. But this was before his company was public. People were aware of it before they announced their existence, let alone they were going to be releasing titles and things. So it was still very much in the this is what I'm going to do. Would you like to be involved? And he asked me to do this because of the titles he was releasing, or he had in place at the time, the titles that he figured I would have something to say with them, just from our conversations on just messaging each other on Facebook, just getting into these long discourses. And I went, oh, okay, yeah. Like I never thought about doing video essays before, but I guess from my experimental work where I use found footage, but then also my programming work, curating film, and even a lot of my, well, obviously my film writing is about film. Even the majority of my experimental work is about previously films that already exist, footage that already exists. It seemed logical, and once he invited me to do that, I said, yeah, I'd like to very much. And yeah, so the first one I ever did was the Amos Poe film Alphabet City. Then I start counting, and Jeremy are with Fun City Editions, and my next one with them is Walking the Edge, which is a great underrated 1983 thriller with Robert Forster. And they have other films later in the year coming, and there's one or two that's coming up that I just for one reason or another I just couldn't be involved with, unfortunately. But yeah, and since then I've done essays for other companies as well. 88 Films in the UK, Imprint Films in Australia, and I have stuff coming up with the British Film Institute, Mondo Macabro, and Severin. And yeah, so I think I've got 7 as of the time of recording, 7 in the can. By the end of the month I'll have 3 more, and more projects coming up later in the year. During the pandemic, Triskel closed, I'm going to be creating a series of video essays to have online via Triskel's website, because it's even if we can't always have, say, online content of actual films, short films, features, whatever, at least content that is about cinema. Also, we're creating that content ourselves. I thought it would be a nice thing to do. So I have a few different ideas and things coming up, but that they should be starting in May 2021. So yeah.
Oh, sounds great. And so you have your sort of production team for your video essays. Obviously, there's the I'm saying it right, Gammy Bam Bam. Is that right?
Gabby, yeah. So Gabby, Gabby Bam Bam. So sometimes I do the voiceovers myself. Sometimes I get other people to do them. It's often dependent, I think, on the material, because I think some essays just seem to be better suited to have a female voice, whether it's content or style or relevance to the people involved in making the film, and or sometimes myself. But Gabby creates original music scores for the essays, which I like doing because it gives the essays, well, first of all, it makes them, there's something about them that's unique to the content rather than simply taking the content from the material we're working from, the source material. So and she's done amazing work as well. Like each one is different from the previous, and she always seems to just nail the relevance of the film that we're working from, using her own score rather than being inspired by the pre-existing scores. You know, sometimes either the content of the film or the visuals or whatever. So yeah, so me and Gabby have been doing these, and before that, we've done some music videos together. What happened was she contacted me out of the blue, saying, "Hi, I see you do music videos. Do you want to collaborate?" And I said, "Well, yeah, you're in Austin, Texas. I'm in Cork, Ireland. Would that be an issue?" She was like, "No, let's be creative." and we were able to work something out. And then since then, she's scored some fiction films for me, some of my experimental work, and now we're doing the video essays. So yeah, so so far me and her always collaborate on these, and she does a great job. And I suppose one thing that's frustrating is, well, sometimes when you're seeing these DVD reviews pick up on the content, you know, reviewing the extra features on the discs, I mean, you know, there's certain elements, like, for example, the booklet liner notes or something like a video essay, they tend to be not always covered in depth in reviews. Yeah, that's fine. It's just the way it is. But I just feel unfortunate that her work is very rarely, if ever, highlighted, because maybe because it's too good or maybe taken for granted. But she really does a good job. We've done, like I said, about 7 now, and we have a few more coming up. So yeah, so it's nice to work with good material as well, because I mean, the movies I've been working with, I've liked all the movies I've done essays for, and they're from eras of filmmaking that I really appreciate and enjoy, and and also it's been a fascinating exercise in sort of editing and pacing to try to get to the heart of the matter. Almost like I treat each of the essays like I'm editing a trailer. I keep joking about this, but it's true. I often relate to, and it sounds comedic, but the kind of stuff that like Joe Dante and Alan Arkish were doing when they were editing trailers for New World Pictures in the 70s. The joke being, oh, when I'm in trouble, I'll insert a shot of a helicopter in the Philippines exploding or something. But no, but seriously, it just the essence of trying to almost to get across whatever point you're trying to make about the material, in the essay is important, but also trying to do it in a very concise way. So it's been a really interesting exercise, and I've started from there editing some like trailers, sometimes just teasers, sometimes like actual theatrical trailers for movies for other people, and obviously that has that same thing where you're trying to find the essence of the material and put it across in a very short amount of time. So yeah, I've been so that's me and Gabby, and obviously other people involved as well. But like I said, she does great work with the music scores.
Yeah. Um, so, and your writing as well. You've written, I remember, Experimental Conversations, which was a really interesting film magazine. You wrote a piece on a Brian De Palma film. I love Brian De Palma. There seems to be people are on the fence about his films for various reasons. But is there a favorite De Palma for you?
Yeah, so the piece I wrote about in Experimental Conversations was Passion, the not the last De Palma film, which was Domino, the one before that, the one with Noomi Rapace and Rachel McAdams. And that film, for example, even amongst De Palma fans, split people. It was really divided people. And as a filmmaker, he does, but even some of the films divide his fans, you know. So sometimes there's films that critics, other times there's films that just divide the fans, and that's one of those. And yeah, I'm a big fan of De Palma. Um, Incredibly visceral filmmaking, incredibly uh, visual and sound, and conveying story as a great De Palma quote when people style is the substance. And uh, I think it's a crying shame that that approach isn't used more in film now, because I think a lot of I mean, it's a sweeping generalization obviously, but I think a lot of film can be very typical in their construction now, almost like they're like there was one time when TV and film were very different mediums, whereas now that TV has evolved into what the streaming services are doing, and the streaming services are creating, I talk about like Netflix and such, are making original content, features and series now. What was very cinematic and what was very TV have blended together now. So uh, what uh, what used to be, so like I remember when I was in film school 20 years ago, when it was still the transition of it was, I mean, the big thing when I was going to film school was when these great independent films were coming out that were shot on video and blown up to 35 mil. So Julian Donkey Boy, 28 Days Later, the Dogma 95, Manifesto, etc. 24-hour Party People. And I remember these discussions where, oh, to make a film cinematic, you just think you'd have like kind of depth of field and different, you know, the lenses, because a lot of the lenses that that video cameras had at the time weren't as you know, weren't as sophisticated as, you know, you could later get and whatever. But now we've gone kind of beyond that. It seems that stuff that seemed cinematic once is now just a given as a standard that you can kind of do on an iPhone sometimes. So I think there's a certain laziness in regards to conveying things with kind of visuals, framing, movement, conveying information. I think De Palma's like exceptionally uh, uh, gifted in that area, you know. And also I just like the themes of his films, the kind of sometimes the very literal, not just the way he would with his camera potentially be voyeuristic, but the voyeurism in the subject matter, the use of the technology to record voyeurism, going back to anything from the early stuff like, you know, Greetings or whatever, and Hi Mom, and also a very dark, sly sense of humor as well, which I really which I just really find amusing, even if sometimes it's quite peculiar. Like, you know, that final moment. I'm not going to give it away, but the final moment in Blowout with the recording, it's a good scream. I mean, it's a tragic moment, but at the same
Yeah.
time, it's quite, you know, bleakly amusing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of De Palma, but the favorite for me, my personal favorite, might be not the best, but my personal favorite might be Body Double. Um, but but at the same time, I could pick so many of them. But I think as my personal favorite, the one that I mean, even parts of it I'd say are flawed, that are perfected in other films of his. But that one in particular just really. Also, when I saw it the first time, just really worked for me, because I saw it, for example, before I saw like people playing, oh, it's mixing elements of Vertigo and Rear Window. Well, I saw it before those films, so it made a stronger impact on me, you know. And even though he might be riffing on those films, he's doing his own with them, so that's important as well. They're not just straightforward imitations. He's actually doing something interesting, I think, and using that grammar, that film grammar, to convey his own interests. Sometimes they're shared by the interests of Hitchcock, but sometimes they're just his own, his own pursuits in cinema.
Yeah. I remember De Palma did an interview with Mark Cousins. I don't know if you've seen it on the scene by scene. That was interesting. I wanted to ask about your filmmaking experience and going back to when you were a film student as well. I know you spent some time in New York in the early 2000s. I know it's a long time ago, but just about, I guess, that experience and just thinking about the Irish film industry generally. Obviously, I know Experimental Film Society and what you've done is one thing, and then sort of the mainstream Irish film industry is sort of going in a different direction. But um, that's kind of a broad question, but I just wondered about that.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of what I was doing, so I went to St. John's in Cork for 2 years, and I had the opportunity of going to the New York Film Academy just for like a 6-week course in the winter of end of 2002, beginning of 2003. And that was an interesting experience because I was in New York, and even the New York then is very different from the New York now. So I was staying in like the East Village. Mondo Kim's and Kim's Video was there. So besides making films or studying about films, I was also just watching a lot of stuff, because obviously pre-internet, it was literally renting videos and trying to like commit them to memory. Or I actually at one point got access to a second VCR and was actually running off copies of stuff to bring back. So I remember bringing back stuff like Robert Downey Sr. films, and some Fassbender films that were difficult to get hold of, and just like literally a suitcase of like 20 odd VHS tapes. And it was an interesting time. And also there was a Robert Altman retrospective going on of all the 70s movies at the time there, so I was seeing those when I could, but I was going out of my way to see the ones that I hadn't or couldn't see at the time. And I actually briefly met him. They were showing, relating back to Irish film industry, they were showing a then newly struck print of Images from 1972, which is a great movie, and it was amazing to see that on the big screen. So I was there for that, and what was nice about that was it was this weird transitional period where it was 1 foot in of the future of, which is digital filmmaking, but still 1 foot in the past, which is the film celluloid. So we were shooting on 16mm, but then editing on digital. So shooting on 16, editing on Final Cut, goodness knows 2 or 3 or whatever it was at the time. And that was a really interesting experience. And once I returned from there, I came back to Ireland, and I've traveled and I've lived in some other places sporadically since then. But I spent a long time trying to make, and I still, up until a few years ago, I did Dream Awake, which was a narrative film, but I've increasingly found myself moving more into this experimental realm of cinema than narrative, partially because narrative can be just so difficult to do when you don't necessarily have, when I say infrastructure, I don't mean the country hasn't got the infrastructure, it certainly does now, but I didn't have my own filmmaking infrastructure amongst like a community of people, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So going back to then even to now in these nearly 20 years, the advancements made in the Irish film industry, it's quite incredible. Like there's a lot of productions going on here. Sometimes it's just literally an Irish film via the funding and filming locations and personnel, but sometimes it's an Irish film with the creative forces behind it being Irish as well, and there's obviously a lot of those going on. So yeah, it's very different in terms of experimental work. Yes, I'm involved in the Experimental Film Society just for the last couple of years. I mean, Rusba, who founded it and spearheads it, like, does his own work, and then all the other filmmakers involved do their own thing, and there's obviously overlap with some of the filmmakers working on each other's films and things. But the films I've done under their banner so far have been 2 found footage pieces, which one of them being with Gabby, doing her doing music, but both of them are found footage pieces where I'm using pre-existing material, so they haven't required any other filmmaker input, but hopefully in the future that might change. But yeah, so there's great stuff going on here in terms of I'm using commercial cinema, and there's also a more always increasing presence of the more avant-garde experimental side of filmmaking as well. So it's an interesting field, and like up until the to the pandemic, it was amazing how many screenings were happening around the world, and not necessarily with film festivals and things, or more smaller scale film festivals, but just screenings happening kind of Eastern Europe and all kinds of places. And it's just been fascinating just to have these works seen and shared around the world. And you're not just, because that's one thing about filmmaking, it's not necessarily the thriving of something to be successful, but you do want it to be seen by people, just simply because it's been made, and you don't want it just to sit on a shelf. You kind of want it to be seen by other people, appreciated, enjoyed, whatever that might, whatever it is. And yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and a lot of great films coming out of all forms. A lot of documentaries as well, actually. There's a lot of documentaries happening in Ireland, as well as the features. So, and I think by now, because when you think about, the way I always put it is there's a lot of English-speaking countries that are in the shadow of another English-speaking country. So Canada would be in the shadow of the US. Well, let's face it, all of us would be in the shadow of the US, but like New Zealand in the shadow of Australia, then Australia, I guess, would be in the shadow from the US, and Ireland would be in the shadow of the UK. and say Australia / New Zealand, Canada, they had their initial sort of, insurgence of national cinema in the 70s. Sometimes it was just cultural or art house cinema or something. It was a lot of the time it was exploitation. But either way, a lot of those films, and let's face it, some of those films might have been Australian, might have been Canadian, but they were trying to pass themselves off as American. My favorite being Harlequin, not favorite film, but favorite example of this Americanization, being that film Harlequin, the Australian movie. How just some of the voice, so some of the voices would be redubbed with very kind of crude kind of American sounding voices. I think there's even a few shots in it where they flip the image so it looked like the cars on the other side of the road, that kind of thing. And obviously there was also this weird thing where like Mad Max was redubbed into kind of these flat mid-Atlantic accents for the American release. And Ireland at the very end of the 70s started to have that first wave of cinema, but for it to really catch on like it did with Australia and Canada, that really didn't, I don't think, came till the early 2000s really. So we're still kind of in our infancy of having a voice that is distinct, and also interesting, like a presence in the, I'm saying marketplace, but I guess that's what cinema is. But I mean, films that were made here have or somehow been strong Irish involvement in the making of those of these films, have done well, either as critically acclaimed films or box office or whatever, to the extent that they're being taken quite sort of seriously. And so yeah, I think particularly in the last 20 years on all sides, even though there was some great films before that, don't get me wrong, but they were not as unified as they are now, I guess.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking as well of Roger Corman had a studio in Galway in the 90s, and from what I've heard, he was a big influence for people learning their trade, people who learned from him, learned from others, etc. And I think he still works. Is that right? He's in some capacity.
Yeah, so Corman turned 95 a few days ago, actually. As of today we're April 7th. I think his birthday was on the 5th, 95. And yeah, I think I believe he's still working. And what's interesting to follow Corman's career as a producer, or head of a company that makes films, if not the actual producer per se, is his years at the New World Pictures era of his filmmaking, which is I think 1970/71 to 1982/83. That's the era of when the likes of Scorsese, Jonathan Demme, of that period of when those filmmakers emerged, and went on to be major sort of forces. That's Jonathan Kaplan and all those kind of guys learned their craft and went on to mainstream success. Ron Howard being another one. But from about the mid 80s, about 83, 84 onwards, when there was New Horizons / Concord, the onwards, that kind of era afterwards, and under that era, the studio in Connemara happened. Some major things happened where the exhibition sector of how just films were shown changed. I mean, I just love the fact that I never actually thought about this till recently. I always loved how a lot of New World films, and very specific, a lot of the later films, were always about 80 minutes long. And it was pointed out to me some time ago that the reason for that is an 80-minute film is only 4 reels instead of 5. So he was making them that length, not out of artistic kind of whatever goal or whatever. It was to cut down on shipping costs when they were films were being shipped to cinemas, which I mean, I love that running time, 75-80 minutes. I think some wonderful films in it, and when you a lot of films going over the 2-hour mark these days, and the Snyder cut of Justice League being 4 hours. I'm not slating the film, I haven't seen it, but it's just, what's wrong with something that's like 75-80 minutes long, like a lot of B movies were that length and things. But by the time you get to the Connemara years of Corman's output, yeah, a lot of the care and attention that I feel, or the same kind of drive, whatever, that used to be there for the theatrical features in the 70s and early 80s, I think because the majority of the outlets were then video or cable or whatever, it's not even about quality, it's the sense of humor, and the treatment of the material changed. So there was often humor in the Corman movies in the 70s, but when you go into this particular era, sometimes they just seem that little bit more tongue-in-cheek to me, and sometimes that works well, and there are some great films in that time period, but sometimes they just seem to lean a little bit too much on the kind of tongue-in-cheekness, which doesn't work as well for me as they did. But there are some really, I've only seen a handful of the ones that were made in Ireland, but it is surreal to see, like, oh, I'm blanking on the name of it, but what's that one with Don the Dragon Wilson, where there's like a detonator for a bomb hidden in a 6-pack of Beamish beer, Beamish cans.
Oh, I'm not sure actually.
It's and it's not even Guinness; it's Beamish. It's just a nice touch, but which I appreciate. Obviously, be down here in Cork, but yeah, it's just really peculiar. So, but at the same time, apparently back in the New World times, there was literally moments where they were like trying to trim frames out of things and everything just to make the pacing faster, and also just to keep the running time down to a 4-reel film, which again is a purely financial thing, but at the same time, I don't know, I just really like that kind of running time and that tautness of putting across the story in that really tight amount of time. You can really pack a lot in to that, and there's no time for meandering or whatever, or you really got to get it across.
Yeah, no. Is there anything you've watched over a lot of time with watching films at home during COVID myself, and we got a projector actually, which is lovely, on the wall. We've been watching a lot of Catherine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy films.
Oh yeah.
Have you ever screened any of them actually?
Yeah, we've never oh my goodness. We have screened stuff with, I'm sure we have. I'm blanking now. We've done at least one, if not two. Not in the Kino times. I'm pretty sure we did in the Triskel era of my programming, but I'm blanking now. Definitely something with Catherine Hepburn. I'm sure it was one with Spencer Tracy and Hepburn as well, but I'm blanking. But yeah, they are great. They are great. I like that. And obviously, I've done stuff with Cary Grant films as well, and like His Girl Friday. We haven't screened His Girl Friday, but I just love those movies, and North by Northwest, and it's just like it's the timing of those films as well, and the witty. I mean, they can be incredibly taut. When you see like the Maltese Falcon, or those 1940s movies have that same kind of rigid tautness that the Corman films would have, you know, which is a weird thing to say, but they do, you know, they move along quite gracefully, but with every shot and line and everything's there for a very specific purpose to convey what it wants to convey to the audience, you know.
Yeah. No, Howard Hawks, like his Girl Friday. I'm even thinking of, you know, Hawks isn't seen generally as such a visual director. But then there's all these questions about authorship, and the composition isn't the only thing. And I think it's an interesting question. And how he stages actors in his films, and obviously Cary Grant is very physical and can be very feminine as well, which was probably pretty rare in those days. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I just did a video essay, which when we finish up here and go back to working on it, I did an essay for an upcoming Fun City Editions disc for the film I mentioned with Robert Forster, Walking the Edge, and it was made in 1983. But on the commentary, the director mentions that the character in it that Forster plays is very much like a character like maybe John Garfield would have played back in the day. And you can actually apply a lot of, say, the characteristics of him with Forster. And when that in mind, when I was watching the movie again, it really does feel like a kind of noir story, but not so much the stylistic elements of them, but more the character-driven qualities to them. And one of the things that's really what was impressive to me about Forster as an actor, and he'd done this throughout his career, but in this particular role, because I was doing the essay, it was seeing how so he was very much committed to the role, to the extent that there were certain elements in the roles that you can imagine certain kind of tough guy actors feeling it might be a bit of a threat to their macho screen image to go with, to show weakness and vulnerability. And he embraced it for the character and his performance, rather than, you know, had any issues with those. And ultimately they work better, because there's always the sense that he's going through all these horrible situations where people are putting him down and stuff, but then there's still something there that you never get the sense that the character is a guy who cannot deal with conflict but chooses to avoid it, but having to meet it, he can do. But he goes through all these quite humiliating situations, and the willingness to do that is something like the way you were saying, like how Cary Grant could be, some of his characteristics or characters, whatever, because certain elements could be kind of perceived as being quite feminine compared to some of his contemporaries. That's a quality that I think shows commitment to a committed performance, and can be very effective as well, and actually work even stronger to convey something than if it was not used to avoid that something, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's it. I must see this film. I love Robert Forster. I think his last role was, was it the Breaking Bad film, or that was one of his last?
It was one of his best. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I did see one around the same time I believe it was done, was a nice cameo with him playing the same character in Better Call Saul. Oh, so yeah, so I haven't seen the Breaking Bad film yet, but yeah, I mean, I rewatched Jackie Brown, which I saw. I had only seen it once back on the weekend it opened, and I loved it, and it really it was one of those films I haven't seen it in a while, but yet it's stuck in my brain. You know, I just could, the whole thing, I could see it in my head, and revisiting it again, I felt like I just seen it yesterday. And I mean, so many great performances. Everyone's great in that, but you know, he's so amazing in that, and I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't found anything in print or whatever in interviews where he states it specifically, but I'd be very surprised if Tarantino had not seen this film and thought Forster would be good for the Max Cherry role, having seen it, you know.
Yeah, I'm thinking even just when we mentioned Gary Cooper, is there a little bit of, could there be a little bit of Gary Cooper in the Max Cherry as well, do you think? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, interestingly, when you look at, say, Forrester's career, I think he was someone who struggled a lot because people always seem to speak well of him and rate his performances. But again, I think another person who, by certain factors, may be taken not seriously or taken for granted, maybe I should say, you know, and you know, there was a long time where he was taking any gig he could get. I mean, like 1985, he really, really did not want to do the villainous terrorist role, with, shall we say, makeup to make him look like a different a person from a different nationality, shall we say, in the Delta Force movie. And he really didn't want to do it, but he was broke. He needed the money, and then he ended up doing lots of villain roles, which, as James Coburn used to say, who, as he got older, he said, "I'm playing another man in a suit," and a lot of those actors did end up playing these kind of shady characters in suits. Roy Scheider played a lot of them, and it was just great that Jackie Brown came along and sort of took Forrester out of that. And even though he didn't have that many roles after that, that still put him in that, gave him a lot to work with. He just constantly was working, and he just had a lot of variety of roles, and it was always a joy to see him pop up and stuff. And yeah, I can definitely see the comparison with Gary Cooper as well, very much so. And yeah, it's a good comparison. Yeah.
You mentioned Coburn there, and I'm thinking of his Peck and Paw films, and I know I think you visited the location for Straw Dogs a number of years ago, and that's personal for you because you family from Cornwall or that area.
Yeah. So, well, Straw Dogs is just one of my favorite films. But but an interesting kind of connection, if you like, to Cornwall, is my father is from Falmouth in Cornwall, which is about 30 odd miles from St. Berrians, where the exteriors of Straw Dogs were set. So, I mean, all the stuff in the house and all that footage was shot in a studio, in a studio, in London, but the exteriors were shot around the village. And I think it was 5 years ago, I went out there, and it's literally like a row of houses and a bend in it. So it's kind of like a long stretch with these houses. Then you come to the center of the town, and raised up, as you see in the film, in the beginning of the film, there's the church with the graveyard. There's the pub, or a pub. Sorry, the pub that's used in the film isn't there, but there's one a couple of doors down now. But you see the building of where the pub was. And then a bit further down from there, past a few more houses, there's a corner shop, and there's a village hall, which I presume is the one that's modelled where the village hall is, as seen in the studio bound one in the movie. And that's it. And it really hasn't changed that much. But what I found when I was there, which maybe doesn't really come across in Straw Dogs, is it feels like this perfect location for a kind of a British Gothic movie like Witchfinder General or Blood on Satan's Claw or one of these movies. It's really effective, and I can see why it was used, but I don't think you don't quite get the essence of just how interesting and unique that area is. But yeah, so for example, my grandmother, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago now, she used to work as an usherette in cinemas, and I think the last film she went to see in the cinema was Lawrence of Arabia. She never went back. I haven't been back to the cinema since, and yet and obviously she would have no interest in seeing a film like Straw Dogs, but she could tell you that Straw Dogs had Dustin Hoffman in it because it was a big Hollywood movie with Dustin Hoffman, which is a big deal. So yeah, and obviously until recently with Bait, the wonderful movie, the black and white one, hand cranked, hand processed 16 mil, and that, there hasn't been many films that were sort of set in Cornwall. Obviously there's a couple, but I think Straw Dogs. I mean, obviously the Straw Dogs. I mean, the accents in Straw Dogs. Nobody sounds Cornish in it. It's like this weird. We often talk about mid-Atlantic accents being used in films. This was like a mid-Atlantic rural accent. It actually sounds more upcountry, really, to me, like something you'd expect. Maybe they sound more Yorkshire in a way than Cornish. But yeah, the Straw Dogs I'm a big fan of. Seeing the locations and the connection to Cornwall is something that is interesting. I mean, when you think about Peckinpah, I think only made 2 films outside of America, America/Mexico, being Cross of Iron in Germany and Straw Dogs in Britain, and it it was set and partially filmed in Cornwall, so that was kind of an interesting. I was a big Peckinpah fan when I was growing up, like Straw Dogs and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in particular being 2 films that I consider favorites and I often revisit. So yeah.
Is there anything you've watched at the moment that's kind of caught you off guard? Something really special that I've watched lately?
Oh, yes. I'm trying to think what. What did I see recently that that I thought was particularly caught me off guard? I'm trying to think. Well, I got to be honest, when things haven't been work related, I've been catching sort of sporadic bits and pieces of kind of more recent films. One of them being, which I actually thought was quite enjoyable, Greenland. Is that what it's called? It was on Netflix recently. As those kind of movies go, I really enjoyed that. And at one point, a friend of mine said he got really quite animated why the film annoyed him and he didn't like it. And he talked about the implausibility of how the family gets separated and are able to get back together again. But I'm like, well, considering what's happening in the world now and where I am in my life, I didn't necessarily want there to be a, bleak, credible situation where they didn't come back together. Do you know what I mean? I wanted there to be some sort of hope, I guess. So, but I thought that film was well done, and considering it kind of had to do things like that to keep characters together, even if it might not be realistic in a real world way. I still thought it had a nice bit of grit to it, and a Scott Glenn cameo, which is always welcome. I'm just trying to think, what else did I see recently? Yeah, I'm blanking. I ended up watching, because to be honest, with a lot of my video essay editing, I've been seeing a lot of older titles really, rather than newer ones. But even new, well, one film that I did like, that I did an essay for, and it was my first time viewing it not so long ago, was Jeremy from 1973. Have you seen that film, Robbie Benson?
I haven't. I know that Mark Kermode talked about it a lot, but I haven't seen it yet.
It's a nice film. It's very sweet, but in a way that I think captures, how do I put it? What I like about it is when someone is of the age of the characters in the film, which is the like 14, 15-year-old characters, their world is their world. Their limited knowledge of the world is is what they have, is all they know exists, and like we all have when we're still of that age and we haven't had life experience and things. So therefore, something that might seem insignificant to, or of little significance to an older person who's gotten older, gone through different relationships and things, might seem kind of trivial or whatever. But this film, it just really captures that kind of how important these small details are in these two young people getting together and kind of finding each other, and has a nice kind of nice documentary feel to it, even though it's you know, certain elements quite stylized, but there's it's shot in 16mm, so it has this nice kind of gritty documentary feel to it. Also, I even go into this in my essay, some really nice uses of the zoom lens, which is, you know, if it was socially acceptable, I would try to use zoom lenses so much more. I love seeing zoom lenses in 70s movies and things, because I think they can be really effective, and they tend to be used more for you know, like a crash zoom or comedic effect or something nowadays. But just to see how the zoom could be subtly used in a movie is so interesting. Like another essay I'm working on at the moment is for the Carl Rise film, The Gambler. You know, some of the zooms in that. And I was watching Star 80 recently, the Bob Fosse film, and just the way it can be used to subtly pull in and out of a situation, the framing in a very subtle way to kind of convey either expanding or, you know, bringing in of the surroundings of a person. It can be really interesting how it can be done, and very effective. So, but sorry, I'm completely blanking now on some other films I've seen recently, even though I'm sure I've seen many. I just can't think of right now.
You mentioned the zoom there, and I often think of the zoom in Altman, and of course a favorite of yours, Nick Rogue.
Yeah.
I quite like Eureka, actually. That courtroom scene really struck with me. I remember there's a crucial zoom in that scene. And of course you interviewed Rogue for the Cork Film Festival years ago.
Yeah, not quite. Well, what happened was I programmed Eureka as a part of this. So around the time that Rogue published his autobiography, The World is Ever Changing, which is a quote from Man Who Fell to Earth, we programmed this season, and we went to, me and Colin McAuliffe went to London to speak with him, to do a little camera piece. But we were kind of given like specific instructions where Colin would do the interview and I would just go along because I wanted to be there. And, you know, at one point kind of Colin was like, if you want to, you can pretty much do it. Like, who's going to know? And I decided to almost to take a back seat, because I was in the presence, because we did it in his study in his house. And I found it more sort of fascinating to hang back and just absorb being in this space for like an hour. And the interview questions were like you know, you tend to find a lot of the questions he gets asked in interviews in his later kind of part of his life. You know, there wasn't always that many very detailed, specific questions about the films. But I think just because he just, you know, either didn't want to talk about them anymore or just maybe couldn't remember. So they tended to be more general. And that's why maybe I was a little bit kind of frustrated going, well, I'd have very maybe specific points, and, you know, like you just wouldn't necessarily, you know, I don't necessarily know if I would be able to get something out of him that I'd be looking for. And I was more interested in just hanging back. And for example, one detail I found fascinating. This was the kind of thing I guess I mean, because I was kind of looking, this is his workspace. This is the study, you know, like this is where he writes and does whatever. There was all these photographs, family kind of photographs of christenings and weddings and whatever. No film related stuff in the study, no, you know, except one photograph. And I think you see it in the documentary that the BBC did a couple of years ago, the most recent one. Bernard Rose is involved in it. And there's one photograph where it's Rogue on set with Donald Cammell making performance. And it's not a gigantic photo, but it's a sizable enough photo compared to a lot of the other photos of the family things, which are almost just like nice little, it seemed in the placement of it on the day we saw it anyway, where it was on the shelf and the sort of the size of it and everything, it just seemed really prominent, you know. And yeah, that was really interesting just to be in that space for a while, and just, you know, hearing him just talk and seeing this elderly gentleman and just kind of going like, wow, you know, and just being in the presence. And of course he's gone now, like so many great artists, you know, that we came to appreciate when we were younger and beyond. So yeah, Eureka's a great film. Big fan of Rogue, and those interviews were never actually. I don't think after all that fuss, I don't think any of the interviews were actually shown at the film festival at the time, but they are online. So they're just like little snippets, like 5-10 minute snippets. There's two parts of them, which are meant to be like almost like intros for a screening or screenings, or whatever. And but yeah, there's some interesting, his general theory on subjects and comment about art and film, you know, always fascinating to listen to. So yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Final thoughts? Not really, other than I guess it'll be interesting to see where things go from here in a multitude of ways with film production, film exhibition. In a weird way for me, what's been nice about the video essays is by doing the video essays, I can not only be somehow creatively working with material that already exists, but also working with material that exists of periods of time that are gone, you know, certain stylistic elements and actors and things and whatever it is, you know, it's in the past. But to somehow create something new out of that material and hopefully say something about it, you know, has been really interesting. But yeah, it will be really interesting to see how filmmaking and exhibition is going to go in the next while, because even when things go back to something like normality, they won't be the same again, and at least for not for a while. And you know, even before the pandemic, Brexit was coming, and how was Brexit going to affect, because the amount of independent film distributors in the UK, it's really fascinating. It's really amazing when you see how many there are, when you realize how many there are. And some of them get EU money, from media money from the EU to release films or to advertise them or market them, whatever it is. And like, I don't know the ins and outs of, I mean, I think for a little while, at least for a period, they're not just pulling that funding, they're going to kind of keep stuff there. But, you know, that obviously will have to be addressed at some point. And since a lot of governments, such as maybe the Tory government in the UK, don't necessarily value the art sector as much as they obviously should, and therefore may not be willing to kind of, you know, put in the money that was there when they were in the EU. Yeah, it would be interesting to see how things go. And because, you know, UK film rights are usually UK/Ireland. They're one and the same, even though they're two different countries. But now one's in the EU and one isn't. Like, so far there's been no specific issues with that, but I'm just wondering how things will play out in the future on that, you know. So yeah, just it's more of a final comments, just general thoughts on something that's going through my head at the moment, I guess, about cinema. Is where will it go from here in terms of its creation of and exhibition of.